The Game Boy has to be one of the most fascinating pieces of video game hardware ever made. It enjoyed a lifespan of over 10 years, has a game library of well over 1,000 games, and that includes Game Boy Color games. The many different versions of the Game Boy hardware have sold over 180 million units worldwide. But this episode of Michael's Retro Game Reviews is not about the Game Boy itself, but two very unusual accessories released towards the end of its life. I present the Game Boy camera and printer. I think the words unusual accessories are an understatement. This has to be the craziest thing you could ever put into your Game Boy's cartridge slots. But once you get past the crazies, you will realise this very clever accessory turns your Game Boy into a basic digital camera, and then when connected to the Game Boy printer, you also gain the ability to print off them pictures. But there's just so much to talk about with these accessories. Where do I start? Well, let's start at the boot screen. As soon as you boot up the Game Boy camera, you are treated to a dancing Mario on the title screen. I found out when doing research for this review that if you press up or down on a D-pad, you can speed or slow down the dancing Mario. Very cool. Once you press start, you have a choice of three options: shoot, play, and view. Let's start with shoot. On the shoot menu you have many options to choose from, but let's just go right into taking some photos. Taking photos is as simple as pointing and shooting, and you can take up to 30 photos, so you have plenty of room to play with if you don't mind deleting unwanted pictures. You can also rotate the camera to take pictures of yourself or what's in front of you. It's best to make sure you have some kind of light source when taking pictures, as the brightness and contrast settings can only do so much to compensate if you don't have enough light. I would advise against using the Game Boy camera with the GameCube Game Boy player. For some reason the images turn out terrible, and it's a pain having to hold the console on its side to take pictures. Once you've taken some photos, you can quickly view them in the check option. Item mode allows you to do a time picture or a time-lapse picture. With time-lapse, you can set how fast and how many pictures are taken. And finally, we have magic. With magic, you can take some pictures with special lenses that give you all sorts of cool effects, and you can even do a montage picture. Panorama Mode allows you to string 4 pictures together in a vertical or horizontal picture. After each picture is taken, the edge of the previous one is shown, so you have some kind of marker to help you connect the next picture to the previous one. If you can get all 4 of your pictures to match, then you can print out a much longer and impressive picture. Game Face is where the fun really happens. You can create a game face by snapping up 4 random pictures of yourself, and you can even add stamps onto them like crazy fangs. Look, I'm a vampire. That pretty much concludes shoot, but wait a minute, what is run? Okay, what the... Alright, after that let's move on to the play option. The menu select for play is a game called Space Fever. If you don't shoot the first 3 UFOs, you get to play what is mostly a generic space shooter with a slight twist. The end boss is a huge evil face you have to shoot. Well, I did say the Game Boy camera was crazy. If you shoot the B UFO at the beginning, you get to play the classic Game & Watch game Ball, but with your game face. How awesome is that? But it only gets better from here. Next, let's shoot the mystery UFO to play a game called Run Run Run. To play Run Run Run, you need to repeatedly press the A button while occasionally pressing up on the D-pad to jump over the hurdles. It's so fun to see your game face run on the screen. Come on, come on. Yes! Haha! Number 1. The last game is DJ, so let's shoot the D UFO. With this game you can use your game face to create music or just play a pre-made tune to mess about with. I'm not very musical, but if you are, then you could make some decent tunes. Look, it's DJ Vampire Michael in the house. And last but not least, the view mode. This is where you can view or print off some of your pictures, and even make tweaks to them, like change the frames, put some stamps on your pictures, or even do some painting and give everyone your pictures a cool mustache. Considering all the Game Boy camera really had to do was just take pictures, there is a surprising amount of extra features crammed onto the special cartridge. I did my best to cover all the features of the Game Boy camera as possible, so I imagine there's still plenty of surprises left to discover. But enough of the Game Boy camera, let's print off some of my random pictures with the Game Boy printer. First thing to note, to power the Game Boy printer you need 6 AA batteries, and once they're in place, turn on the printer. Next, we need to feed in the paper to the printer. Make sure the pointy end of the printer paper at the beginning of the roll is sticking out under the roll, and then slide it in through the gap. Once you have enough paper in, press the big feed button to fully feed in your paper. When you have fed in the paper just past the arrow, tear it off, but make sure you tear it off from left to right. The reason for this is because on the back of the paper we have a removable strip that helps you peel off the back of paper so you can stick your images onto things. By tearing off from the side with the removable strip first, you're more likely to get a successful tear without any mess from that strip getting in the way. If you don't have the printer connected to the Game Boy but want to test it, then turn off the printer and turn it on again. But when you turn it back on, make sure you're holding down the feed button first, as this will force the printer to print out the test image. All we need to do now is just connect the link cable from the Game Boy to the printer. To connect the printer to the original Game Boy, you need an adapter or a cable with a large connector on one end and a shorter one on the other. The standard Game Boy link cable used with the Game Boy Pocket or Color is the most hassle-free way of connecting a Game Boy to a Game Boy printer. A complete Game Boy printer should come with a cable, and if it doesn't, then make sure you buy one with a cable. If you already have a link cable, then that's one less issue to deal with. Once you have your printer all set up and connected to your Game Boy, you're all set to go. Printing is easy, and it's just a matter of selecting what photo you want to print in the view option, and then select and print. You can also use the printer to print off special images in certain games like Super Mario Bros. Deluxe or Harvest Moon 2, so the printer is not exclusively used just for the Game Boy camera. The printer itself doesn't use ink cartridges but thermal paper. This means the images are created with heat, not ink, so you won't be needing any ink cartridges. Getting new rolls of Game Boy printer paper is not a problem for the time being, as plenty of people still sell them for a reasonable price on eBay. It's amazing that you can still get printer paper for the Game Boy printer, and the only reason why must be because Nintendo produced way too much of it back in the day. This is great news for retro gamers who want to try the Game Boy camera but also be able to print off their images with the Game Boy printer, but word of warning, stock up on these because you won't be able to get them forever. But the greatest thing about the Game Boy camera and printer is its history and how it helped to shape digital photography and even its influence on pop culture, so let's take a trip back to the past. The Game Boy camera was invented by Masato Kuwahara, who worked for Nintendo's Research and Development Lab No. 1, which is Nintendo's oldest R&D department. Initially, the idea of the Game Boy camera was not well received by Nintendo, so Masato Kuwahara sought help from the president of Creative Inc., Hirokazuka Tanaka, to help develop this accessory as one complete piece to be shown to Nintendo. The Game Boy camera was approved, and further development was done at Nintendo's R&D department No. 1 with assistance from a company called Jupiter. This final stage of the project was overseen by Hirokazuka Tanaka. Before becoming president of Creative Inc. in 1995, Hirokazu was a composer for Nintendo. You might have heard of some of his music in many classic Nintendo games, and he was one of the 3 composers that created the wonderful but crazy soundtrack to the Game Boy camera. In 1998, the Game Boy camera was released and became an instant hit. I haven't got any sales numbers to back this up, but the fact that the Game Boy camera was the first mass-produced affordable digital camera made it a must-have accessory for any Game Boy owner. For many people, the Game Boy camera would be their first taste of digital photography. For this review, I did some research into the history of digital photography, and I was surprised that the Game Boy camera never gets mentioned. It's clearly obvious that the Game Boy camera had some kind of influence and helped set the course that digital photography would take, but I'm guessing there's still some stigma attached to video games. But hopefully one day the Game Boy camera will be fully recognised for its contribution to digital photography. However, it was mentioned in the 1999 Guinness Book of World Records for being the world's smallest digital camera. Since then, that record has been beaten many times. The Game Boy camera and printer relied mainly on word of mouth for exposure, as most game and magazine publications passed on covering it. The reason for the lack of press was because the Game Boy camera was essentially just an accessory and not a game. I guess from their point of view, why should they waste magazine space talking about an accessory when they could use it to cover another game, or what the heck, just place another advert. There was one exception to this, and that was the unofficial UK N64 magazine, which devoted a regular monthly column to the Game Boy camera and printer. This lack of exposure from gaming magazines didn't seem to hurt the Game Boy camera and printer. In fact, the word of mouth press that was generated by gamers helped these accessories to become a part of pop culture. Both Paul McCartney and Neil Young's album covers were taken on a Game Boy camera, and the 2001 Chinese zombie horror comedy Biozombie heavily featured a Game Boy camera in it. And one last thing to mention, Rare's 2000 sequel to GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, was originally going to include a feature called face mapping. This feature would allow you to transfer a picture from the Game Boy camera using the N64 transfer pack to the game. Once your image was imported, you could map it onto a character's face, and then play as yourself or against a friend in the multiplayer mode. This feature never made it into the final game, and we were told it was removed because of technical difficulties. It was later revealed that the true reason this feature was removed was on moral grounds. To quote an old GameStop article, "In light of recent shootings in American schools, it seemed appropriate to remove a feature that would allow players to shoot virtual representations of friends, teachers, or even celebrities." As cool as this feature would have been, I do understand why it was removed and respect Rare's decision. So, my final thoughts. Why still use the Game Boy camera and printer now? Well, it's a tough question because cameras and even mobile devices have for some time been able to take high quality digital pictures, and print them off couldn't be any more easier, as most family households have a computer with a printer, or failing that, you can just use your nearest printer kiosk. But with all this technology we have now, again, why still use the Game Boy camera and printer? Well, these accessories are still fun to play with and offer loads of features besides just taking pictures. And the images that come out of the Game Boy printer have a unique art style to them that to this day people still try to replicate in Photoshop or with 8-bit camera apps. If anything, this is a great collector's piece with some cool history behind it that would look great in any retro game collection, so I give the Game Boy camera and printer the thumb of approval. I want to say a special thank you to M&M Games for providing the Game Boy printer for this review. If you're in the London area, then check out the shop or look them up on YouTube and Facebook. Also, if you're a game reviewer trying to get hold of a certain game to review, then get in contact with them, and for a mention of M&M Games in your review, they will happily give you a discount. Thank you for watching this review, and I better get back to reviewing a certain game.